Today I'm going to demonstrate how I'm going to lengthen the power lead on the switches for the SuperNova fishing lights that I'm going to be installing on my kayak. I happen to know that I'm going to mount these switches behind the seat of my kayak, but then the actual battery is going to be back in a hatch that's behind me. So what I need to do is I need to provide power to all four of these switches, but then I need to have a lead that's long enough that I can get it back to where the battery is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some 22 gauge wire, which is the same gauge as the wire that comes with the lights, and I'm going to go ahead and pull off probably 2 or 3 feet. Better to have a little bit more than I need than not enough. I'll go ahead and cut that off, and I'm not worried about dressing this end right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, and these wires are not pre-tinned at all, but what I want to do is take the power lead, or where power is going to come into the switch, for each one of these switches, and I'm going to go ahead and put them together, and once they're together I'll actually twist them the same way that I would if I were using a wire nut to do that kind of electrical connection. Now the only issue that I have is normally the 1/4 inch heat shrink that is supplied by SuperNova would be enough to cover all these wires if I was only doing 2 switches, maybe 3, in addition to this power wire right here. But because I've gone so big, I'm going to have to use a larger heat shrink. This is, I believe, 3/16. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead and push this up onto the wires, and I want to get it back far enough that it won't be affected by the heat of my soldering, but then once the connection is soldered and everything's in place real tight, then I'll be able to go ahead and pull that back down. Now the reason I'm twisting these this way is because in the future, if I need to remove just a single wire or a single switch with them twisted together like this, I can just heat up the solder, and once it's loose I can pull that one individual strand or switch back off, which is how you would do that. Now I probably don't need it, but I have my wiring diagram in front of me just to keep me straight. And again, what we're doing is we're ganging all 4 of these switches together, and eventually the other end of this power wire would go into my fuse, and I'm going to mount the fuse as close to the battery as possible. Now for this demonstration I want to go ahead and use my helping hands to hold this, and hopefully this is in a good spot where you'll be able to see what I'm doing pretty well. I'm also using rosin core solder, probably larger than I would normally use, but since I'm doing video, a smaller gauge of solder like I normally use would get lost and you wouldn't be able to see it. So the key to doing this is I've already got solder on my iron, and my iron's nice and hot. I've used distilled water on my sponge just because it keeps things nice and clean. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a good bit of solder directly on the iron, and then a little bit more, but you'll notice what I'm doing is I'm actually heating up the wires and letting that melt the solder. And there it goes. The wires are hot enough now that they're starting to melt the solder all by themselves, and of course the solder will go wherever the heat goes. That's more than enough. Make sure I leave a little extra solder on my tip. What that does is it keeps it from oxidizing on me. And that's actually the only solder connection I have to make right now, so I can go ahead and turn that off. Now again, this is a good solid connection. There's enough solder on there that all 5 of these wires are now electrically the same place. The other advantage, by the way, to using this clamp right here is you saw how long I had to leave the soldering iron on to get all those wires heated up because there's so many of them. Well, this acts as a heat sink. It prevented the heat from getting back and affecting my shrink tubing, because I'm going to need to be able to push that back down in a minute and go ahead and cover that. That'll help make a mechanical connection. These wires shouldn't go anywhere, and water's not really an issue inside my kayak, but I like to be on the safe side, so I'm kind of a little bit overdoing this. Now what I'm going to do is take this piece of 1/4 inch heat shrink, and I'll go ahead and put it over these wires about as far as they'll go. After I heat this up, I'm going to go ahead and crimp the end down. Most heat shrink comes with glue in it, so by doing that, it'll make a nice seal so that there's no way water would ever go in there. The next sound you're going to hear is my heat gun, And I choose to use a heat gun instead of a lighter because I can control the heat better, no chance of lighting my heat shrink on fire. Give that just a second to heat up. Before that gets too cool, I'll grab my pliers right here and go ahead and crimp that down. Using pliers simply because that's hot enough that if I use my fingers, I am likely to cut them or burn them, and that would be bad. Okay, now what I can do, make sure that this is all cooled enough to touch. Now I can go ahead and push this larger heat shrink down. And you'll notice that I'm going over top of the other heat shrink that I put on a minute ago. That's one of the advantages to using two colors, as you can see that a little better. And as you can see now, all my connections are made. I will probably trim this up just a little bit, a little longer than it needs to be, but again, you can see that's nice and flat, so no water could get there. Got a nice tight seal here. So not only are the wires being held together by the solder, but also I think of this extra heat shrink as kind of a mechanical hold on that as well. And now I will be free to go ahead and run the other end of this power wire down to where the battery is. The fuse will go on that end again because I want it as close to the battery as possible. And that is how you run a power lead to multiple switches for SuperNova fishing lights.